Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Rausan Pereira. The world is witnessing unprecedented times due to the coronavirus pandemic. Not even the best of minds are aware of the treatment or the prevention in terms of vaccine or a medicine. These extraordinary happenings will definitely impact the world order. The lethal combination of an interconnected world and a deadly virus without a cure is taking humanity into uncharted waters. COVID-19, in all likelihood, will fundamentally transform the world as we know it. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the global world order post COVID-19. Joining me on the program today are Gerard Buchan, Director, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Vivek, Katju, former ambassador, and Pant, Head Strategic Studies Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. All right, Ambassador, let me begin the program with you. Let's first try and, I for one, am sure that things will not be the same going forward, but will we see a change in the global world order post COVID-19?
I'm still struggling, to be quite frank with you. America is certainly the world's preeminent power. It has the resources, both natural and in human capital, to retain that position. The question coming to my mind is, does it have the will? And will its political system show the kind of coherence and solidarity which will be required as we move forward into the post-COVID age? I'm still not persuaded that China has all that it takes to step into America's shoes or to be a real rival, a true rival in any sense of the word. So the situation now is quite unlike what it was after the Second World War, when the European powers were simply exhausted. I don't see America exhausted at this moment. So the question really is, under Trump, America has withdrawn. If it continues to withdraw, then of course we will be in uncharted territory. But if America shows the will moving forward, then it will overcome this setback and will be able to assert its position in the world. And hence, I don't see a great transformation in American preeminence, subject to the caveats that I've mentioned.
Okay. All right. Let me take what you're saying to the other panelists now. So, Buchan, this question, we'll take this particular aspect forward. So, will we see the dominance of the United States diminishing slowly as a result of the economic concerns really post the lockdowns? Because we know that the United States has been one of the worst affected countries really as far as this particular issue is concerned.
Yeah, good evening, Frank, and thank you for having me on your program. I heard the ambassador's comments, and I couldn't agree with him more. I think it is a fatal step to write the United States off in any way, shape, or form at the moment. On every metric of great power status, the United States leads the world unquestionably, and I include China in that. I think if I can make a crude football analogy, perhaps, 20 years ago, the United States could beat China in any competition, 100-0. And I think now it's something like 92-30. But we have been here before where the world writes the United States off, most particularly in the late 1960s and through to the mid-1970s. The United States did withdraw post-Vietnam. But as the United States has done time and time again over the last 120 years, it has an extraordinary ability to bounce back and to reinvent itself. It continues to lead the world in innovation, in technology, and of course, grounded at the very center is its liberal democracy.
Okay, all right. So, Professor Pant, can the West really recover from the kind of losses that they have seen as a result of the lockdowns? We know that Europe has been very badly affected as a result of COVID-19. Similar is the case, in most Western countries. So how bad are the losses there, and how much of power can they wield once we see some kind of normalcy?
I think certainly one has seen in Europe, in Western Europe, in America, a certain, inability to crisis, at least in the initial phases. Now, certainly the West will bounce back. It will eventually come back to normalcy over a period of time. But I think one question that perhaps has animated a lot of discussion is what China has done in the meanwhile to take advantage of this activity from the West, the inability to lead this. Traditionally, whenever there used to be global crises of any magnitude, what we would see is the ability of the West, and in particular America, to rally the world around, to rally a global response to such crises. And in this case, what we are witnessing is West's inability to do that. Certainly, West will come back, America will come back, and America could not be written off. But I think the challenge for both United States and I think in some ways now to China is that what happens post this crisis abates, how do you put Humpty Dumpty back together? How do you put governance back together? And in some ways, while America has been exposed, we have seen some vulnerabilities of America and the West coming out because of this crisis. The Chinese Communist Party itself has also been exposed. So what we are looking at is quite a big leadership vacuum globally, where we find enormous problems in those entities which we have traditionally defined or tried to describe as global leaders, and where the discussion before COVID-19 about what is happening to the underpinnings of global order. So I think what we are certainly going to see is an acceleration of some of these trends, where what was happening before COVID-19, a discussion around structural change in the global order, whether West is retreating, whether America is retreating, whether China is rising, some of that acceleration would perhaps continue. But I think China also has come out very, very problematically post this crisis, will come out very, very problematically, and a lot of contestation, a lot of pushback from other countries we are already witnessing. So clearly for that global order, for global governance, in that space, we are going to see a lot of fragmentation and a lot of contestation.
Okay, all right. So let's take this particular aspect of China forward. Ambassador, I'd like to hear your thoughts now. Is there a sense of mistrust really as far as the global community is concerned when it comes to China? And do governments want to move away from their dependence on Beijing?
I think in the ultimate analysis, all countries will be very wary of the Chinese. The Chinese conduct in the initial stages of this crisis is open to question. There is, and I think correctly, a great deal of suspicion about how they acted in the first 2 months. Perhaps if they had been more open, things would have been better today. They could have warned other countries that look, and this was especially when they had locked down Hubei province, that look, things are bad and you better take precautions. They did nothing of the kind. Then again, the Chinese style of acting in the assistance program that they are running, the aggressiveness that they are showing, all this will not be taken well by the international community. But the point, Frank, if you permit me, one point that I wish to make is that I think while American preeminence will remain, unless of course something catastrophic happens, what we will see is a questioning by the emerging powers about the structures of global governance. For example, in the UN system, how long can the UN Security Council, after this crisis, turn its back on the claims of countries like India, like South Africa, like Germany, like Japan, to get a seat on the high table? I think these are the areas which will be in contest. And it is here, I'm afraid, that if enough imagination is not shown by, say, the P5 going forward, then things will be in turmoil.
What needs to be done, do you think? Since you brought up this issue of multilateral organizations and how regulatory bodies have worked, or rather how their particular doings have been suspect. What do you believe is the best way forward as far as these organizations are concerned?
Look, I'm not so bothered about the WHO. Of course, it's in the eye of the storm today, and its track record over the last 2 months again raises many questions. But I think today is not the time when frankly funding should have been withdrawn from it. But the simple principle is that the post-COVID world cannot be determined by the rules that were framed by the victors of the Second World War. That has been under challenge, and now that challenge will grow greatly.
Okay, all right. So since we are here, two aspects that I want to take forward with you, Patrick. One, of course, is how have the regulatory and multilateral organizations really fared, and what will their role be going forward? Another aspect, of course, is is how China is being viewed in the United States, because we know that President Trump has criticized China on several fronts.
Yeah, Frank, let me address your first question. I have long felt that when global architecture and the systems that govern global norms and behaviors, the multilateral system that the United States and the great powers set up after the Second World War, when foreign policy reality and the global architecture start to diverge, then we have a problem. We saw this after the First World War. So the world of today, the systems we have today represent the world of 1945, not the world of 2020. The ambassador correctly pointed out, when countries such as, in my personal opinion, India, Japan and Germany do not sit at the big table with the permanent five, then we start to get cracks appearing in the system. And I think China has very, very successfully exploited those cracks. And the danger becomes that countries start to exercise sovereign powers outside of the system. And I would note that the system that was created has served us all on every metric. The levels of poverty, the rise of women in society. And by the way, China has been the largest beneficiary of that system. On the second question, I think that we will see a restructuring to an extent of the multilateral system. We're already seeing this. The ambassador alluded to this. We're already seeing this in the World Health Organization. I understand they are in the eye of the storm, but we're seeing leaders across the Western world start to question its validity. My concern becomes that leaders start to question the validity of all of the multilateral systems. So I think some re-engineering needs to be made. Doesn't mean we need to recreate the entire system, but we certainly need to recognize reality and adjust the systems that we have. And COVID presents the opportunity for us to do that. Because in my opinion, those liberal-minded and like-minded democracies, if we do not take that lead, China surely will. The second point, Frank, I'd like to make to you, our colleagues at the Pew Research Centre undertook polling recently last month. Before the COVID, the extent of China's role in COVID was really revealed. This is in mid-March. For the first time, we're seeing net negatives on China in America, in polling here in the United States at 66%. I would add that is across all demographics, all ages, those with college degrees and those without. We are seeing an anti-Chinese communist party, and I emphasize that very strongly, not against the Chinese people, but against the Chinese Communist Party, a dissatisfaction that we have not seen in a long, long time. Okay. And I believe with the Chinese leadership as it remains, we will not see any change in that levels of polling and dissatisfaction and distrust of China.
All right. So let's take this particular aspect forward, Harshdeep Pant. The ambassador also alluded to that particular fact about how there is a sense of mistrust really as far as governments around the world are concerned while looking at Beijing. But wanting to move away from China is one thing, but can the world actually do without China at this point in time?
Yes, I think that is clearly the million-dollar question in terms of, even when you talk of global governance architecture, for example, you need a global governance architecture where China is a participant, because on almost all crucial global governance issues, you can't find solutions to those problems unless China is at the table. And therefore, clearly there is the need needs to be some sort of a balance struck between China's misbehavior in some areas and China's ability to bring to bear its own power towards global solutions. Now, what we are now witnessing is something unprecedented, which I think we need to recognize. This anti-China, Chinese Communist Party sentiment, this anti-Beijing sentiment that we are seeing today cuts across North America, Europe, and I think even in a country like India, where we have seen increasing sentiment against what the Chinese mishandling of this crisis in the initial phase, and the kind of statements that we are hearing now from Western Europe in particular gives you an indication of the anger that is there in the political elites vis-a-vis against China, and I think that will transform or will translate into something which, as I think Patrick pointed out. But if it is not harnessed properly, then it can also lead to dismantling of the entire architecture without anyone actually benefiting from it. So what we need to find out is how do we move forward as a policy response to this problem? Because clearly China has played its hands in a manner that was that clearly are generating negative externalities for China. But for all of us, the worry is that they're generating negative externalities for the entire global governance architecture. People are not happy with Chinese behavior. They are not happy with what is happening in WHO. And they blame the entire global governance architecture for the ills of the present day systems. So clearly, I think we need some semblance of some ability to bring to bear, to harness China's power to greater good. But I think that is also up to China and Chinese leadership to a certain extent of how far they are willing to go. And that is what I mentioned at the very beginning, that if China does not recognize, or Chinese Communist Party leadership does not recognize the shift in public mood, in the mood of political elites, then there is a danger of greater fragmentation of global governance, which by definition would not remain global governance. So global governance, if it is fragmented, will not be global governance. And I think that's the reality we may increasingly find ourselves moving towards, and that can be an increasingly dangerous world for all of us.
Okay, all right. We've spoken about the West, we've spoken about China. Let's talk about India now. Ambassador, what role do you see India playing going forward, really, as far as the world table is concerned?
I think India will have to play on its strengths. India has been already part of the rule-making bodies of the world, and I think India's participation in these rule-making structures will only be conducive to global governance, because unlike the Chinese, there is an instinct in India to follow global rules. I don't think we like to disturb things far too much. Perhaps we should be a little more disruptive than we are, but that's what has been part of our tradition, and I don't see that changing. It is really now for the world to see, especially the Western democracies, in particular the United States, on how to really get in countries like India, Germany and Japan into formal structures, notwithstanding the negatives that will come from China and from many other countries. So while India will be assertive, quite frankly, till now we've done quite well in managing COVID, but we have to keep our fingers crossed moving forward. But whatever may happen, India's position in the world, I think, will rest assured. Yes, there will maybe for some time turning inwards while we do restructure our economy to a bit, to an extent, while we focus more on our own issues relating to poverty alleviation. But that doesn't mean that our engagement with the world will slow down.
Okay. Patrick, where do you see India really in the months and the years to come?
Frank, I think that I'll take a slightly contrarian view to what the ambassador just outlined to your viewers. In my opinion, we're seeing a generational shift within the political elites, particularly in the national security and foreign policy bureaucracies in India. The non-aligned movement mentality has governed India's foreign policy since independence. I think the younger generation that we're seeing coming through, they have been educated in the West, and they realise that India's star has risen to the point that India can no longer, I guess, take the positions that it's taken for so long. India is a great power on every metric of measure. That's a fact. and particularly as the United States for the last 10 or 15 years has looked to India as a key ally, not only in the Indo-Pacific, not only in the region, but globally. That's just a fact that India has reached a point it can no longer ignore and no longer play, play the card mentally that we, the Indians, can sort of sit on the sidelines, if you will. I do agree with the ambassador. I would like to see formally India integrated and to have a seat at the big table. India is a shining example to the world, a country of its size that adheres to the rule of law and that is a liberal democracy. And we understand, of course, there are significant domestic problems that the ambassador referred to that still need to be alleviated, poverty alleviation first and foremost. But the world can no longer ignore India's status, and the world now looks to countries, particularly like Japan and India, as beacons of democracy and leadership throughout the region and indeed the world.
Okay, all right. And since we are here, Professor, what do we need to focus on going forward as a country? And also, how do we leverage the goodwill that we have received as a result of everything that we have done over the last 45 days with regards to the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I think, if you look from the very beginning of this crisis, India's response has been quite contrary to some of the responses that we were witnessing from other major powers, where other major powers were really focused inwards. Perhaps rightly in their consideration. But if you compare that to India's response, India was trying to engage the outside world from the very beginning of this crisis, whether it was Prime Minister's call for setting up the SAARC conference, video conferencing, whether it was Prime Minister's initiative to mobilize G20, whether it was this initiative now to engage with 55 odd countries around the world by supplying medicines, HCQ and paracetamol. I think all of that, India has played its cards relatively well, despite all the constraints that India faces as an emerging power, as a country with limited resources compared to some of the other countries in the world. And I think that allows India's position also to be juxtaposed vis-a-vis Chinese response. We were talking about Chinese aggressive response to some of these crises. Even at a time of this pandemic, Chinese are militarily aggressive in certain geographies, which compares very unfavorably with what India has been doing. India has been engaging with the rest of the world as a responsible global stakeholder should. And I think the point here is that India has always, since last decade almost, has been arguing that India wants to be a rule maker, not merely a rule taker. And in that spirit, I think India needs to be not only incorporated, but I think India also needs to think beyond the traditional structures of global governance, because clearly, something like UN Security Council, one can debate about it for till cows come home. But since the rules of the game are such that, it will be very difficult for India to be there anytime soon. So clearly, we need alternative structures where India can participate to its fullest potential. And I think with friends around that India has cultivated, with relationships, bilateral and multilateral, that India has cultivated, I think that should not be that difficult. And clearly, we have seen some alternatives, for example, that India has used in its own neighborhood, whether it is the Indian Ocean initiatives that India has pursued, or whether it is focusing from a largely defunct SAARC to a more productive BIMSTEC, perhaps. Those initiatives India continues to move forward with. So in its own way, India has pushed the ball, India has rolled the ball in directions where it wants to. And I think the world has recognized that change. And perhaps after the immediate crisis subsides, when world looks back at the responses of major powers, India would stand out very, very favorably.
Okay, all right. Time now to get quick closing comments from all my guests with the best way forward, starting first with you, Ambassador.
Look, as far as the world order is concerned, the primary focus of this discussion, I am convinced that the real role will have to be played by the Americans, and the ball is really in the American court. The only problem at the moment is President Trump's leadership, which is very worrying, because he's seeming to withdraw. He's seeming as if he doesn't want American leadership to prevail. But I'm sure that the American system as a whole has the resilience and the vision to understand that moving forward, America must retain its preeminent status in the world and be the anchor of the world order. If that doesn't happen, then the kind of worries that Harsh has expressed may come about.
Okay, all right, Patrick.
Frank, thank you. Thanks again. Thank you for having me on your program. I would like to echo the ambassador's words. I'd also note when the United States, sneezes, the world gets a cold. The United States is the anchor of the world, both in its values and in the power and security that provides the world. In my opinion, China, through this COVID crisis, had a golden opportunity to seize, to an extent, the mantle of global leadership through its obfuscation of where COVID originated from, the fact that it allowed it to spread. It failed to grab that mantle. The United States, in my opinion, on every metric, will continue to lead the world, and irregardless of who wins the election in November, we will see a regenerated United States back on the world stage. But the world will change post-COVID, no doubt. The question is to what extent, and in my opinion, it will not be to the extent that many of what we call the Chicken Little types say it will.
Okay, all right. And Harshdeep Pant, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I think two essential issues will pervade the discourse post-COVID once the immediate crisis settles down. One would be, of course, the structural shift, where which power takes the mantle of the global leader. And I think we are still at a stage where things are in flux, both for America and for China, for very different sets of reasons. And I think the second point, which I think we have not discussed, is greater shift in our understanding of what it means to be globalized in today's world. And I think as countries start looking more and more inwards, as countries start challenging the traditional global supply chains, as countries start looking at how to reconfigure their engagement with the wider world in the economic realm, we are going to witness a dramatically different economic environment than perhaps we have become used to over the past few decades. And I think that will also fundamentally alter our understanding of what it means to be living in 21st century globalized environment.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. What's emerging is the fact that not much is going to change really post-COVID-19 as far as the global world order is concerned, is what the panelists are suggesting. Of course, things are not going to be the same, but to what extent they are going to change remains to be seen. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.